Modern rallying is a glorious sport. It's exciting and it's intensely professional. But of course it's taken quite a long time to reach this level. It really started to get professional in the late 50s. And what we've done is got together a bunch of the people who were involved in those glorious years, and we've tried to trace the evolution of the sport. Rallying in the late 50s and early 60s probably was its nicest time because it was starting to get professional. But I remember the first rally I did on the continent, which was the Sestri Air Rally. We zigzagged from Boulogne to Italy, going from one Michelin Guide hotel to another, and we had a super time, but it was all rather relaxed, and I found documents in the file saying, we've done bloody well, we finished 35th overall on the Monte Carlo Rally.
One must admire manufacturers whose cars are tested on a course like this, when the results are studied the world over. From France, Citroën with their ID19. From Italy, Alfa Romeo and their Giuliettas. From Britain, Roots and the Sunbeams. Standard with their Triumphs. Ford and their Zephyrs. And DMC with the Austin Healys.
Among the drivers were John Sprinzel, who was highly successful in British national rallying, Willie Cave, who's now in TV, Les Leston's son, Peter Jopp, and one of the greatest, Peter Harper.
I enjoyed rallying more when there was no wrecking, when you just got the rigs and the route and you just set off. That to me was rallying as it should be. For me it was a golden age.
Costs were relatively low, so plenty of manufacturers contested the European Championship. The rallies, mainly on tarmac, were tough on the cars and on the crews, and they just had to grab their brakes whenever they could.
A pause to cool off, for ahead lies Italy's highest pass. And now there's a Grand Prix to the Stelvio.
The Stelvio Pass was one of the classic sections in rallying, tough on drivers and cars, with hairpin after hairpin. Just look at it. No wonder people raved about the climb. Even motorsport's Dennis Jenkinson, here acting as a trainee marshal.
But the Denzel isn't making things any easier for the next man.
Note that none of the cars carried sponsorship stickers in those days. Sponsorship really got underway towards the end of the 60s. But while that increased, round the houses racing at the end of rallies, like this, largely declined. The only things really like it nowadays are the tests on the RAC round the stately homes of England.
In those days, the change of pace between English driving and a Scandinavian on a special stage was it was mind-boggling. I think at those times the Scandinavians and the Finns had been special stage rallying on forests and in snowy conditions, and they had this tremendous competition amongst themselves and this will to win, which they still have got.
Appears quite unaffected by fatigue, and he and Stuart Turner make an almost unbeatably efficient rally crew. But with the Saab lifting high its inside rear wheel, for Carlson...
I think the reason Eric Carlson dominated rallying early in the 60s and was so much quicker than any of the British drivers was he was the first of the Scandinavians to really come down and show the Europeans what it was all about. He'd had a lot of experience back home, and he got this devilment, which we saw in the later Scandinavians, but he really was the first.
Lang still has Carlson on his tail, and now Siegel Morris joins them on the big Grand Touring heat. And at the gasworks, Siegel Morris takes Carlson and sets off after Lang. And here's Eric Carlson giving his navigator Gunnar Hagbaum his first experience of the Monte Carlo Rally. Close behind, as they were throughout the journey, Pat Moss and Ann Wisdom. The famous Morley brothers in action.
Pat was certainly a force to be reckoned with, certainly in the Healy days. And, you know, to do any good in a Healy, you had got to beat Pat as well as all the rest of the opposition.
The leader, Pat Moss, is doubtful of her spark plugs.
I would think the Healy was certainly one of the great rally cars. It was always known as the Big Healy. They were always painted red and were considered to be big, red, hairy monsters, and quite a car to enjoy driving.
Now it's Timo Makinen's turn.
When I had chance to go to Austin Healy was in after RAC 62, and the Monte entry was closed, and BMC was ready to enter the Christopher Gala with the Austin Healy 3000, and Stuart said, if you like, you can drive with her and you can do the driving. And because before that I've been driving D-type Jaguar in Finland for the dirt track racing and ice racing, things like that. When I get in the Austin Healy, I was like home. It was fantastic to drive, and Austin Healy had disc brakes all around, big wheels. It was very, very good rally car that day. There was 180 horsepower, 1,000 kilo. And if you take Escort today, we have 230 horsepower, 240 horsepower, and 930 kilo, what are, I will say, very similar motor cars.
The Big Healy was generally faster than other sports cars. Well, no, perhaps that's wrong. The Porsche was just as fast, or in fact faster. The Big Healy was certainly a very strong motor car. Yes, the Porsche is particularly driven by people like Hans Walter, and a little later on, Gunther Klaas, were forces really to be reckoned with. In fact, they were, I suppose, faster motor cars. We never considered the Sunbeam Tiger as being very serious opposition. It was quite a good car, and I think it really needed further development, and it was dropped before its potential was fully developed.
One of the problems we had was that it was homologated for the American market, and we never used it to that stage of homologation. In other words, when I was disqualified on the Alpine, we in fact could have had another 40 brake horsepower. If you compared it with the Tiger, the Imp was far, far quicker than the Tiger in a forest, for two reasons. First of all, it was a lot smaller. You could get that sideways on and still stay on the road, whereas if you've got a Tiger sideways on, you probably lost the back end. Secondly, it had terrific traction. Out of a hairpin, for example, an Imp would leave a Tiger miles behind.
Even at controls, there's quite a lot to be done. Refueling and sorting ourselves out for the next section. And I'm not looking for my handbag, in case that's what you think.
It's rather a sad fact that, to my knowledge, no woman driver in the decade ever slept her way into a works drive, but certainly in that decade, the woman driver that dominated completely was Pat Moss. In fact, it's safe to say she was the only woman driver who could really take her place with the men. When she was driving Healys, or, well, Healys in particular, and the Mini to some extent, she could take on and beat any of the current male drivers at the time.
Ann Hall was also competitive, particularly when navigated by Val Domleo, who's now married to Donald Morley.
I rallied beside a number of very good lady rally drivers, but the very best, head and shoulders above all the others, was Pat Moss. Her experience was far greater than that of all the others put together, and the professional attitude she brought to rallying was quite above all the others that I navigated for.
Looking back over the drivers, Eric strode over the first few years, obviously. I think Timo then took over, but other people floated in and out. I think Eugen Boehringer was perhaps one of the real characters. He was the Fangio of rally, and in fact his career rather advanced Rauno Altonen's and contributed to this Finnish invasion, because Rauno first made his name on a Polish rally when he was Eugen's co-driver. Then, of course, as far as Britain's concerned, we should never underrate the contribution Paddy made to win the Monte and to be a character, and I think motorsport needs characters.
front-wheel drive was the thing that first, it was a new technique for me in driving. I couldn't drive on loose roads. I mean, for years I was quite good on asphalt, but didn't know how to drive on a loose road. And I think I learned this technique with the Mini, and therefore I fell in love with the car. When I won the Monty in '64, it was a terrific surprise to me. I know it's like, I suppose, ice skating or anything else. You know when you've done a good performance.
Of course, winning the Monte Carlo Rally was most important that time, and my first international win was with Mini Cooper S in '64 Tulip Rally.
I didn't like the Mini nearly as well as the Healey. I never was really at home with front-wheel drive. I did drive a Mini to start with on the 1960 Monte Carlo Rally, and in fact the last event I drove for BMC was the 1965 Monte Carlo Rally, again in a Mini.
Mini was a very good car. It was very right size car for rally car. It was very small. You can have much better driving line with other cars, and the weight was very low.
It's perhaps rather sad that the Mini is best known for the Monte Carlo Rally, in which it was turfed out because of the lighting fiasco, and it really was a fiasco.
They went through the cars with a fine-tooth comb and they tried to disqualify us on something else, and then they finally did it on the lights, and the whole point was that the lights didn't help us to win the rally at all. It didn't make any difference.
Paddy Hopkirk also had trouble on the '66 Acropolis Rally when he was thrown out on a minor servicing technicality. But going back to the Monty, someone else involved in the lighting squabble with his Lotus Cortina was a driver still relatively new on the international scene, Roger Clark.
I started rallying quite a lot in my own Mini, and we used to do very well and enjoy it. But basically I prefer rear-wheel drive cars, and obviously the more power the better.
Until the Escort came, we had driven Rovers and then Cortinas, both of which were relatively big cars.
Here is the 23-year-old newcomer, Roger Clark, with the sole survivor of the once powerful Rover.
Well, the Rover was a car with a lot of character and great fun to drive. I think with the Rover team we were very light-hearted and very happy, and we had a lot of fun together.
Then, just as now, that there was a lot of importance attached to category results and class results.
At the time I had my own private Cortina to rally in England when the Rover team were only really interested in the big international Zodies. And to me, the Cortina was the car that got me my Works drive, because I think it was '65 and we were very successful against the Works team of Cortinas, and we won the Welsh, the Gulf, the Scottish. The next year we moved into the Works team, and that was then running Ford Cortinas, and it was a very successful car.
Roger's example still holds true today. The surest way into a Works team is to beat the Works drivers at their own game.
In those days, the big difference between amateur and professional driving was the extent of the service backup that one had. In 1965, I think, we did 4 or 5 full factory-backed events for Rovers with all the service one could wish. And in the same year, we did maybe 4 or 5 other events in Roger's Cortina. The extent of the service for that was simply a bag of tools in the back. Until we actually drove for one of the factories, we never had any service cars at all.
I used to build my own car anyway, so it was no real hardship to repair it when I broke it. Nowadays, I suppose we've been spoilt, and I might grumble a bit if I had to get under the car, but it's still possible to do it.
So, at last, to the final briefing and the allocation of responsibilities by team manager Bill Barnett, each to his own. The support team will have to follow a schedule almost as demanding as the drivers.
Then we saw the growth of pace notes and co-driving, and then it has to be, the rest of the decade has to be these damn Scandinavians, because they were so quick. They were all beady-eyed, they were all desperately determined to be the best, and you have to realise that Finland, it's a very nice place to go for a holiday, but a week or two and you can soon get bored with Sibelius and lakes and trees, and I think they like to get out of the place. It's a bit like Scottish racing drivers. They're glad to go into the bigger world. And because of this, Timo, Rauno, Simo, all the others, Hannu, have all wanted to get to the top. And we're seeing exactly the same determination today with Ari Vatanen.
Well, during the start of this period, my first introduction to pace notes was very interesting because I was doing the '63 Monte Carlo Rally, which was really my first serious paid event with a foreign team, which was BMC Sweden. We got to the start of the first special stage, the Col de Granier, and I was handed these sort of this funny writing on a piece of paper by Tony Ambrose. And although I couldn't speak any Swedish and Bengt Söderström couldn't speak any English, I read out this fast left, fast right. And by the end of this test, Bengt Söderström was understanding it and I was understanding it.
The 60s saw great strides in pace notes. Earlier, crews mainly had navigational notes telling them which way to turn at junctions, roundabouts and so on. But as special tests at high speeds over closed roads became common, crews developed sophisticated systems which allowed a navigator to describe every bend to the driver, thus making him both faster and safer. And because of the strain on voices, intercoms also had to be developed.
The only particular road or stage that has remained consistent from the early days is the Col de Turini, which figures so prominently in the Monte Carlo Rally. And in the early days, the minis, they were going over in the 22, 23 minute bracket. That's from the village of La Boulaine to Moulinet or vice versa. And over the years, the speeds have risen to such an extent that for this 24 kilometers, a quick cut is now breaking the 18-minute mark on the same event. That's the sort of increase in speeds we're getting.
Of course, today the cars are much, much faster. It's, if you take the best Mini that time today and do the rally, you cannot do very well. I think the RAC you can finish 20th or something like that.
If every event was a special stage event, it would soon become very boring. It would become like racing. The reason I like rallying, I think the reason a lot of people like rallying, is the change of scenery and the different types of events. You know, there is a case for events like the Safari.
The 60s also saw a case for even longer events. Much longer than the Safari Rally was the first of the really marathon events, the London to Sydney.
November the 24th, 1968, a record crowd at London's Crystal Palace. And they've come...
I think the marathon type events are fantastic because you're going to new countries and instead of going round and round in circles, they also catch the imagination of the public much more from the point of view you're going somewhere. It started off and turned out much easier than I thought it was going to be from the point of view of sleep, etc. The only thing was that the one bit we didn't do a reconnaissance of in central Australia was the one bit that fooled us, and is where I damaged the car badly on a bump that wasn't on the notes. And it just shows one that you must, to be professional now, reconnoitre every piece of the route.
Maybe because I hadn't practiced at all, I hadn't seen any of the route. I was expecting it to be ridiculously hard. The event went so well for myself and over Anderson that it wasn't difficult, and we enjoyed every minute of it. But we were venturing very much into the unknown, as I had no time to do any practice whatsoever.
The cavalcade set off on the last long left.
The Hunter was obviously very strong, but then again it wasn't anywhere near as fast as the Fords, and had there been no retirements in that area, we only retired a matter of 5 hours from the end. It wouldn't have been a race. We would have been a long way ahead of them. We were very frightened at one time. There were people on the car, on the roof, on the boot. In fact, we got out of one control and found someone's shoe trapped in the rear bumper.
The latter part of the 10 years saw this battle between manufacturers and the FIA to produce cars to their regulations, and you have a situation that with big manufacturers, they will always be able to circumvent whatever regulations the controlling body chooses to put up. And we had this problem with the Mini Coopers and the Lotus Cortinas. They were built to a particular set of regulations.
One of the serious hold-ups in the Mini, and one of the reasons why the Mini, I think, faded out of the scene was, although it was front-wheel drive and very good on loose roads, when it actually came to the forest, these roads got a high hump in the middle, and the Mini with the sump guard had very, very little ground clearance, and in fact you ended up skating every time you went on the brakes, you were skating on the sump guard, and this was really slowing the car up. Then we went to 12-inch wheels, but we could never get the car to handle properly.
But But then as more powerful cars came on, the Mini quite simply ran out of size of tyres. We couldn't get the power down on the road. And this is really why cars like the Lotus Cortina, then of course the Escort, overtook it.
Just as perhaps the first half of the 60s belonged to the Mini, so the end of the era belonged to the Escort.
Obviously when the Escort came along it was a much better car for rallying, but the Cortina covered an awful lot of miles in competition. I think the main benefit of the Escort was it was more compact. Obviously the power-weight ratio was better alongside that, but the main thing was the Escort was just the right size to wind down the mountain roads.
I still feel, because I'm very much involved with Scandinavian drivers and Finns in particular, that they do still have an edge in competitiveness. They still have this tremendous will to win. Of course, we are catching up very, very quickly, and now we have caught up. But there was one remark of Stuart Turner's in those early days. He said they are going to drive quickly, or going to have a shock as to how quickly they drive, but if they have an accident, they've planned it. And I still remember that to this day.
The increasing domination of Scandinavian drivers was perhaps the key feature of the period we've covered. But there were other things: pace notes, elaborate servicing, and a generally more professional approach. It's easy to get starry-eyed with nostalgia, even though we've probably missed out many cars and many drivers. But I guess that when people look back on the 70s, they will also be described as golden years, particularly in Britain, with drivers like Russell Brooks, Billy Coleman, Harry Vatanen, and of course the king himself, Roger Clark.